Okay, welcome back. So today we're going to continue on with slavery in English America, the English colonies of the Americas, and we're going to move a little farther south. So last time we, of course, did New England. We're going to talk about the middle colonies now, and of course, the South. Now, when we talk about the middle colonies, we're talking about really geographically speaking, they're sort of in the mid-Atlantic. They're in between the New England colonies and the Southern colonies. These are going to be the colonies that become New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, these areas. So we have to kind of start with the Dutch, I think, because what we're talking about here is the African slave experience in what would become, of course, um, the United States. But it didn't always start that way. So in the beginning, in the middle colonies, the Dutch were the ones that were there first, with their small settlements. The Dutch, that is, the people who come from the Netherlands, right? They're going to have some small settlements here. And it's going to be very, very difficult to recruit a lot of workers. A lot of white servants, a lot of white workers don't want to come. They don't want to work here. Now, there's various reasons for that. One of them is that the Dutch have a lot of middle class people. And so there's not a lot of poverty there, not a lot of reason to leave like you see in England. Lots of poverty, lots of reasons to want to go. So, not really much of a push factor there in terms of what's going on back home. So, not a lot of white people come here to work. They don't want to come here as indentured servants. They don't want to come here as workers. But the colony does need workers. The colony will become heavily involved in trade. Now we know that the colony was involved, of course, in the trade with Native American peoples, especially the fur trade. Much like the French, the Dutch were here to trade, and of course, looking for that Northwest Passage kind of thing. So they're heavily involved in trade, and so they become involved in the slave trade. And they, of course, will themselves hold slaves, especially in the area called New Netherland. New Netherland is this area that encompasses several pieces of several states as we know them today, right? Like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, like that. So they're going to be heavily involved in the slave trade and in holding slaves. Now, under the Dutch, the slaves are going to be held by a private company. So you're not going to see a lot of private owners of slaves outside of the Dutch West India Company's ownership of them. So they're owned by sort of like a corporation of sorts. And these slaves are going to be they're going to be the ones that build up New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is the heart of New Netherland. Today, what do we know that as? Manhattan Island, right? We know famously that the Dutch buy, quote unquote, however you want to put it, Manhattan Island from the native peoples. A guy named Peter Minuit, actually, right? Peter Minuit, Minuit. Peter Minuit, he actually buys it for like what, $24 or something, right? Um, and so New Amsterdam is the heart of it, and here you're going to see where most of the slaves live and work under the Dutch. They're going to be skilled and unskilled laborers. They're going to do things like clearing land, but they're also going to be, and of course, being porters, right? Carrying things. But they're also going to be involved in farming and working, building things. So they're not just working on the docks and farming and clearing land. They're also actually building up New Amsterdam itself. They build buildings, they build a fort there, and in fact, they build a wall. They build a wall for the protection of the Dutch from others. Now, you've heard of Wall Street. The reason that it's called Wall Street is because there had been a wall there in that region of Manhattan today. That wall, of course, is not there anymore, but the street is called Wall Street. And again, it was slaves and other servants, but lots and lots of slaves who, in fact, built that wall as protection for the Dutch. Now, the slaves here are able to establish families. The Dutch don't want race mixing between white and black. So, what do? They import women and they import them as slaves just so that there would be no race mixing And so that the male slaves, of course, people realize that, people are going to want to be with others in their lives. They're going to want to have relationships. And in fact, the Dutch actually legalized marriage among slaves. You don't see this in places like Virginia, right? You're not going to see this in the deeper South. You do see this in places like New England and, of course, here in the middle colonies. You will see that the law actually recognizes marriage among slaves. In fact, a lot of slaves even get married inside Dutch churches. And so there's a sense of family here. In fact, the child that would be born of this wedding, of this marriage, would take the name of the biological father, not the owner. The child is a slave. However, the child would take the name of the biological father, not the owner, which is going to be different in places like the South, where a child is going to take legally the name of the owner. In the under the Dutch system, what you're going to see is something else, and this is going to suggest strong family ties, right? Slave marriages are legal. Children have the name of their biological father, so there's a very strong sort of paternal or patriarchal kind of flow here. Um, Now, as you can imagine, these slaves live sort of differently from what we've seen and what we will see. Slaves are going to be working in a variety of circumstances and are going to be seen in a variety of ways. And in fact, not only do they have some of the things that we just talked about, but slaves under the Dutch are going to be allowed to actually engage in military service. They're going to be used to fight back native peoples. And service in this military is going to give them a place. It's going to give them a sense of belonging, credibility, even in fact potential for freedom. So these are not people who are going to be slaves in the sense that slaves in the Chesapeake are going to live or exist. They're also not going to be slaves the way they are in the Deep South, which we will see momentarily. They're going to have a place. They're going to have sort of this ambiguous sort of status. In fact, a free black population takes hold in New Netherland. And because of the size of that population and it's free black, and because of the contributions that slaves are making, you're going to see eventually that slaves are going to claim freedoms in Dutch courts. In the 1630s and right around the 1630s up to the 1660s, you're going to see that a lot of slaves are going to start suing in court for their freedom. Now, it's interesting, and this is kind of confusing. They don't win freedom outright. They win what we call sort of a half freedom, halfway, 50%, if you want to put it that way. But it's really not 50%. Let me kind of flesh this out. They're going to be free, but with some restrictions. So it's like, yeah, you're free, but. So this half freedom involves things like legal rights in court. Your legal rights are recognized. You're not going to see this in the South. Legal rights in court are recognized. You can give testimony. You can sue. But what are your rights? You have some rights outside of the court, meaning you don't just have the right to testimony and the right to sue. You have legal rights in yourself, but these rights are limited. So you have freedom, but restrictions. Examples of this are that they win back wages, right? So slaves, when they sue, they win back wages, and they actually get to work their own land. So this is good. You work your own land, and you don't have to work for free, is the sense, is what comes out of this. However, even though you might win your freedom and have your own land and you get some back wages, the company will make you pay a special tax. So it's sort of a slave tax. So if you're a slave or formerly a slave, you still have to pay a tax. So there's still a burden on you. Now, of course, you're a lot freer than you were, but you're still different. Also, they are forced to work for the company whenever the company needs them. So if the company needs them to join the military real quick to defend the colony, if the company, needs these people to get off their farms and come help build some building or another, they're going to be forced to do that. So they're not completely free. But when they're forced to do that, they're still going to get wages. So this doesn't sound really like the slavery that we are accustomed to talking about. That's why it's called half freedom. You're forced to work, but you get wages. You're free, but you got to pay a tax. You're free, but when we need you, we'll call for you, and then we'll pay you. Now, a lot of the adults end up winning their freedom. But when they win their freedom, these men go to court, and not all of them win. It depends largely, we don't need to go too deeply into it, but it depends largely on the contributions and their status and so forth, and how much time they served. The point is, a lot of black men win their freedom in courts, this half freedom, I should say. But in doing so, they don't win the freedom of their children. You might have just come out of court a winner with your half freedom, but your child is still fully a slave. On the other hand, interestingly, your wife is now free, or at least half free, the way you are. And so slaves under the Dutch are living a very sort of interesting and ambiguous sort of life. And they hold this status, I should say. And they are really becoming at this point part of Dutch colonial society. They speak Dutch. They will very often serve in the Dutch militia. They're recognized. Black people, these half-free people, are recognized as church members. Even slaves were getting married inside Dutch churches. So they're seen as some part of colonial society among the Dutch. And they're living and working in a very diverse community. There's a lot of black people. Some are free, some are enslaved, some are indentured. And there's white indentured servants, though there are fewer and fewer of those. And the black population is rising by the late 1600s. All of this points to, as I said, the ambiguous status of slaves under the Dutch. Black does not equal slave. Not as we understand it. Although it is only black people who are subjected to this half freedom. So, try to work that out. When the English come, 1 out of every 5 black people is free. 20% of them are free in New Netherland. But all these freedoms have been hard fought. In fact, there's a continuing conflict amongst the Dutch and continuing sort of debate about about the status of black people. There's a lot of racism here. Let's be honest. And this conflict is going to sharpen once the British come. The British, the English, if you prefer, will take over an area. We know that this happens, right? Because it becomes New York. They take over an area with a lot of black slaves, a lot of free black people, and some white indentured servants, and a variety of people, right? And so, but they're also taking over this sort of ambiguous status of slaves. You're going to see in 1664, though, New Netherland fall to the English. By this time, land-hungry settlers have already invaded Dutch claims. Remember, there's not a lot of Dutch settlers to come, so what happens is that a lot of English people go there, and they just start settling. They start squatting on the land. You may have heard of this idea of squatting, right? It may not be yours, but you go and live on it like it's yours. New Netherland, of course, is going to change. But for the moment, at least, areas like New York, Delaware, New Jersey, even Connecticut, this is New Netherland, those areas are by the 1660s run by the Dutch, but already by the 1660s populated by a lot of English folk. Now, most of these people had come here for land and the fur trade and looking for a Northwest Passage as well. So much like the Dutch, they're engaging in the fur trade, they're engaging in looking for the Northwest Passage, at least initially. Eventually, the King of England is like, you know what? And everybody, the English people realizes, there's more of us than there are of them. Why do we have to follow their rule? So what do? The King of England, he actually sends his military to take over the meager, and to defeat the meager defenses of the Dutch. So, I mean, it's a quick sort of foray. They bust them out of there. They roust them out. And then the King of England just starts actually giving out all kinds of land to rich people back home in England. The king wants to spread aristocracy, so he wants to um, really make more robust and more powerful the nobility that surrounds him. So he gives them a lot of land in the Americas, in the English colonies, in this area of New York, New Netherlands still. And so he wants to spread aristocracy, but he also has a lot of money that he owes. He owes nobles because, the fighting of wars costs money, and very often the crown will take, loans from the lower nobles, and he owes them a lot of money. So in order to pay off debts and in order to spread aristocracy, he just gives them a bunch of land. And then, of course, he renames New Netherland and gives it to his brother, the Duke of York. Excuse me, I got into a coughing fit, so I had to mute for a little while. Okay, so the Duke of York. Now, the Duke of York is going to promote slavery. He's going to promote the trading of slaves. And of course, the concept that the English have of slavery is going to be very, very different from the concept that the Dutch had. In fact, the Dutch concept of slavery was guided really by a Dutch philosopher who talked about the equality, or at least the spiritual equality, the humanity of Black people, which is why you see a difference under the Dutch. But the Duke of York isn't going to be buying all that stuff, right? So he's going to promote slavery. He's going to promote the trading of slaves. He wants to make money. So they start importing slaves left, right, and center. Now, they're going to be importing what are known as seasoned slaves. And you're going to see this not just amongst in the middle colonies, but you're going to see the purchase of seasoned slaves up and down the colonies. What is a seasoned slave? It is someone who has not just been taken from Africa, put on a boat, and dumped in New York. It is someone who has actually been taken from Africa, or whose parents were taken from Africa and then taken to the Caribbean, where most of the seasoning happens. In the Caribbean, they are, to put it badly, broken in as slaves. If you want to run a society with slaves, or even a slave society, well, you're not going to want slaves that are constantly trying to overtake you. That's going to happen anyway. But it is these fresh off the boat slaves that are the most trouble for you. The ones that are straight from Africa, the ones who are like, no, I'm still going to fight this. I'm still not quite broken. Yes, you've been through the trip through Africa and the Barracoon and, of course, the Middle Passage, but you're still fighting. A lot of these seasoned slaves are actually going to be children who are born to the people who were brought over. These are people born into slavery. These are people whose parents and grandparents maybe taught them, hey, this is how you survive as a slave. We've tried everything, and this is the only life that you have. And so you want these slaves, if you are someone who wants slaves at all, you want seasoned slaves. These slaves who know that they're slaves. They're psychologically conditioned in a sense, also physically conditioned because of the different climates. And so these slaves are brought to places like New York and the surrounding areas, and of course, to other colonies as well. Seasoned slaves are becoming the preferred by colonists who can afford them. Seasoned slaves, as you can imagine, are more expensive. So they're not always going to be easy to get because they're more expensive. It's like somebody else has gone through the trouble of breaking in this person. It's cheaper to buy one fresh off the boat, but then you got to deal with that person who does not want to be enslaved. None of them want to be enslaved, but I think you understand the difference as they saw it. These slaves are going to come to New York and the surrounding areas of the middle colonies. They're going to perform a variety of jobs. Skilled work is common in these areas. It's not going to be like in the Deep South plantation stuff, right? Or even the Chesapeake plantations where they're growing tobacco. You're going to see these slaves performing a variety of work because there's only so much farm work to be done. And so you're going to see them also rising in population. already by 1700, the black population in the middle colonies, especially New Netherland, especially New Amsterdam, I should say, is rising faster than the white population. And so by the 1700s, you're going to see slavery spreading to the other mid-Atlantic colonies, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania is an interesting one. Slavery grows there too, and it's in large part it's because Philadelphia is a port city, right? So a lot of trade goes on through port cities. Slaves are working there on the docks. Eventually, they're going to be working in the interior of Pennsylvania. But what's interesting about Pennsylvania is that despite the growth of slavery there, it will become a center of abolitionism in the coming years. A lot of this has to do with the Quakers, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what I want to sort of emphasize now is that I think you should already be seeing a difference between the North and the South as regards slavery. There's a difference there. There's a different tradition. Among the Quakers especially, you're going to see, and the Quakers, by the way, they're called a Society of Friends, but they were called the Quakers. And the Quakers are known for their religious toleration. They're known for wanting to have civil relations with Native peoples. We know that William Penn, Penn, right? We know that he sets up this Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers. The Society of Friends. He wants religious toleration and so forth. And he actually promotes the idea that Native peoples shouldn't have their lands taken from them, that in fact they should be paid a fair price. So Pennsylvania is going to be a little bit different here on several fronts, right? So you have the Quaker influence with religious toleration, civil relations with Native peoples. Now, many Quakers do own slaves. However, it is the Quakers that are going to be amongst the earliest questioners of slavery. Germanic Quakers in Pennsylvania are going to be amongst the very first, and they're going to say, look, they say, we are Quakers and we are persecuted everywhere we go. One of the reasons that the Quakers came here is because they were persecuted back in England. These are some among the rare people who actually believed in religious toleration when they came here. Remember, the Puritans didn't believe that, and most people coming to the Chesapeake in the South don't believe that, but the Quakers do. They believe in religious toleration, and so they are hounded and persecuted wherever they go. And so what they're thinking is, look, as Germanic Quakers, we are persecuted, and we understand persecution. What you do to us is similar to what you do to Black people when you enslave them. And in fact, they go even further, and they say, look, Black people deserve freedom. Why? Because they are spiritual equals in the eyes of God. Spiritual equals. Now, slavery still grows here, but many more Quakers begin questioning slavery by 1700s. More and more and more. Progressive. So by 1700, we're going to see and still a lot of Dutch farmers using a mixture of slaves, and indentured servants. There's still, all the slaves are Black, but you're going to have indentured servants, still a lot of whites, some Black. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that they're not really growing cash crops, right? And the Black population is rising in this area. Slaves and indentured servants, they're doing a variety of work, right? Domestic, farming, porting, unskilled, skilled work. But at the same time, we must recognize that the color line is hardening here in the mid-Atlantic colonies. Freedom becomes harder and harder to get. Eventually, the English, by 1700 or so, are going to be instituting new laws, new slave codes to discourage the freeing of slaves. The freeing of slaves has a special term. It's called manumission. So whenever you hear me talk about manumission, you should realize I'm talking about the freeing of slaves. And there's a variety of ways for a slave to obtain manumission. You can, of course, purchase yourself. And manumission tends to really mean, depending on how you look at it, really tends to mean sort of this legal freeing from slavery. So back in the day, in the early years of slavery, you could actually purchase your own freedom. It sounds kind of strange, but you could. You could buy yourself. If you were a slave living in one of these areas where slavery is not as strict as it is in other places, then you could eventually perhaps earn enough money to actually buy yourself, because you have some skills perhaps, or because your master isn't always all over you. You've done the work for the day or whatever. You go off and you hire yourself out. You might be able to pick up a few pennies here and there. And over time, you have enough money to free yourself. So self-purchase was something that was happening. It was a thing, as people say. Also, the purchase of others. There's a lot of history where black people buy other black people. You might have heard this before. Why is it that black people own slaves? Most of these, probably, I would have to look at it more closely, but I'm close to saying all of them. But most of these, again, close to all of them, I would say, are people who buy other people in order to free them. And yes, they still hold them as slaves on paper, but that's only so that they won't be re-enslaved. We're going to talk more about this down the road. The point is, manumission is possible, but it is becoming less and less likely in British America. And of course, nothing compares to what we see happening in the South as regards slavery. South especially. We know the South encompasses the Chesapeake, which of course is Maryland and Virginia. But the Deep South is going to be really what we think of when we think of slavery, especially the Carolinas and of course later Georgia. Carolinas used to be, well, today they're North Carolina and South Carolina, but they used to be one colony. And initially the Carolinas are set up as a harmonious society for ordinary folk. The people who come here really want to set up a good society with, for ordinary folk to have a say in government, where people work on family farms. There's not these large land grants to rich folk. The idea is to give land to families. So this is supposed to be a harmonious kind of, we're all going to get along society. You have a say in government, so do I. You have land, so do I. And there was a form of religious toleration as well. To a point, right? Let's not go crazy, but certainly more than the Puritans by far. What's ironic, though, is that the Carolinas will eventually legalize slavery. And they do so early on in their constitution. In 1669, they write this constitution, which was ironically written by a man named John Locke. John Locke, L-O-C-K-E, right? I could have put his name up there, but just because I don't put the word on the slide doesn't mean you're not responsible for it. So make sure you pay attention to everything that I say in the lecture. So John Locke is the guy, English philosopher, who is perhaps known best of all for his theory. There were several theories several philosophers who brought up this idea, but this idea of natural rights and limited government, right? Natural rights. He said we all have rights as human beings. We all are born with natural rights. Now, he said it was life, liberty, and property. Later on, the Declaration of Independence will say life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But he believed life, liberty, and property are natural rights. We all have a right to it. It's not something that can be taken away, right? These are inalienable rights. Well, it's interesting that it is John Locke that actually writes the Constitution that legalizes slavery. So, the color line is pretty stark in some places, particularly the South. So why is it that even though it was set up, or at least intended to be a slave or a harmonious society, they actually eventually will turn hard towards slavery? And of course, it has to do with a cash crop. What is the cash crop in the Carolinas at this time? It is not cotton. Cotton comes later. We're going to see that. One of the things that people don't recognize is that slavery existed for centuries before cotton even becomes a thing, before cotton becomes king, as we will say later on. It is rice. White settlers turned to growing rice, and they import a bunch of slaves to do it. It is going to be an important cash crop. And why do they turn to African workers? Well, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about already, but then something else, and that is African workers, or Africans, I should say, from West Africa had a long history of growing rice. They knew how to grow rice. And so the African workers are, in fact, the Africans, in fact, are the ones that teach the Carolina people how to grow rice. The African workers there, the small number of slaves that are there, actually teach white Carolinians how to grow rice. Rice flourishes in the region as it did in West Africa, and before you know it, the white Carolinians are like, well, you're really good at this. We need more of you. So what happens? They begin importing slaves by huge numbers. And so by the early 1700s, you're going to see some really strict and not so humanitarian slave codes that are going to be cropping up. Severe punishment of slaves is legal. This is going to spread to other colonies as well. But by the early 1700s, especially in Carolinas and then, of course, Georgia, we're going to see these slave codes are really, really harsh. You're not going to get punished if you castrate your slave. Think about that. Castration. The cutting off of the testicles, to put it quite bluntly. Punishment, of course, in the form of whippings. That one we know of. Also, hamstringing. Sometimes they will cut your hamstring if you keep running away. Now, doing this is not going to be something that they turn to right away, because once they hamstring you, you're not going to be the great worker that they want you to be. So they reserve this for those instances where you just keep running away and nobody else will buy you. We will finally hamstring you, maybe mutilate your foot or something. That way you can't run away. We're going to catch you easily, and we'll put you out, somewhere where you can do work where you don't have to do a lot of moving around or walking around. So castration, whipping, hamstringing. Also for women, cropping of ears, right? So they would cut women's ears off sometimes. This is nasty, disgusting stuff. And of course, branding. We've seen that before, right? A slave that runs away all the time, and that's where most of these punishments. That's why most of these punishments happen when slaves run away. So they will get whipped. Ordinarily, they may have their ears cropped. If they're women, they may be branded. The slave codes even go as far to say that killing a slave is not prohibited if the slave is rebelling. If the slave is rebelling against you, meaning, and what does that mean? Well, you could be even a slave that just doesn't want to do the work that you're forcing him to do that day. That's a rebellious slave. It doesn't mean necessarily a slave that takes up arms against you, but someone who goes against your authority. So you can kill that person, and it's not prohibited. So in the Carolinas, you will see a slave society growing. This is going to be different from the northern colonies that are societies with slaves. These are slave societies. These are societies that are going to be based on a cash crop, and as such are going to need a very, very stable and docile, that is docile and malleable workforce, meaning a stable society, or excuse me, a stable workforce with people you can push around and tell what to do. And because you need that workforce there, slavery is going to be, in fact, the bedrock principle of the bedrock foundation, really, of these societies. As slave societies, they will be built upon slavery. So the economy, the politics, the law, the very society where people stand is going to be based on this idea that slaves are at the bottom. And so you're going to see slaves in the Carolinas living a very harsh life. Plantations, and that's what you have, these large plantations, they're brutal, with harsh punishments, right? Severe punishment and hard work. People who work in the fields are going to live very short lives. There's going to be very few children there. because you're not going to really buy a child to come and live, or excuse me, work in this circumstance, in this situation, because the work is too harsh, too backbreaking. And a lot of children, if they're born to a slave, are going to die early because of the circumstances in which they live. So they live short lives. They have a very low survival rate among babies, and so their lives are going to be much more brutal. Their existence is much more brutalized than it, of course, in the North. Now, on the other hand, they will have less direct supervision. Well, why? A lot of white folk stay away from the Carolina plantations. There's a lot of malaria there. There's a lot of malaria, and therefore a lot of white people don't want to live there. And so the Carolinas are going to be slow in the growth of the with regard to the growth of the white population. You're going to see the Carolinas be majority black, as we will see in Georgia down the road. And a lot of this has to do with the climate and, of course, malaria. Even the owner, the plantation and slave owner, is going to be largely absent. They don't want to live there. They're going to live somewhere in England, and they're going to have other people who oversee their whole plantation and slave system. They will have white overseers that will oversee the whole thing, and they will have other people that they will use slaves to drive other slaves. Now, why is it that slaves don't die off in huge numbers from malaria? Well, I might have mentioned this before, but maybe I'm having deja vu, but I'll just go into it. And that is that Africans have a sort of natural immunity to malaria. Malaria, of course, was something that was rampant throughout Africa. I don't want to say that it started there because I don't really know. It may have been the Mediterranean, but whatever. The point is, it ran rampant through Africa. And over time, Africans developed an immunity to it. The bad part of this is that the immunity is part of what is known as sickle cell anemia. Some of you may know what this is, or know someone with it. It's a very unfortunate circumstance where that happens to people with African blood, usually, almost always, I think. And that is your red blood cell, they're supposed to be round, like a disc shaped, but instead they kind of look like a half moon, like a crescent, right? Like a sickle, right? And I'm pretty sure I did talk about this before, but that's okay. So because of this mutation, right, that protects them from malaria, that same mutation can cause sickle cell anemia, which can cause death. Now, the fact that they are largely, or sometimes, or as a group, immune to malaria, this very fact reinforces in white people the belief that Africans are particularly suited for tropical field work. This is what they're for. That's why God made them. Didn't make us this way, made them this way. Therefore, we are doing God's will. We are going to put them to work in these circumstances. So a lot of white folks stay away from the plantations because of malaria, and these slaves are working in the fields, being overseen by a white man, usually a Scots-Irish guy who's kind of made his way up, right? And in the fields, these slaves are going to be directed by a driver, a black man holding a whip, really. And so notice sort of the different levels of this hierarchy, right? You have at the top the English dude, who is the owner. He is English, may be born in the Caribbean, but he still considers himself English. He's at the top, he's the owner. The overseer at the plantation, a white man, usually Scots-Irish, so not really English. So he's a level below, not just in terms of the work, but in terms of the social status, because English people don't like Scots-Irish. If you've never seen the movie Braveheart, you need to. And then, of course, below them is the black slave driver, the black man holding the whip, that is driving the slaves. So there's a whole hierarchy here with regard to social status as well as work. Now, interestingly, in the Carolinas, slaves actually have more free time than those in the Chesapeake. In the Chesapeake, they're working on tobacco. Tobacco requires constant attention, constant work. They're working from can't see to can't see, which means you get up in the morning, it's dark. You stop work at night, it's dark. So when you start work and you stop work, it's dark. Can't see to can't see. That's the tobacco system. However, in the Chesapeake, they're going to work under what is known as the task system. Rice is plantation slavery, but the people who work on rice, the slaves, don't have to be constantly tending to it. I don't really know why. I'm not a farmer. But here's the thing. There's a difference between rice and tobacco in that rice does not require constant attention. That means that you, if you are a slave under the system, are going to be working under a task system. What does this mean? Okay, today you have 10 things I want you to do, 10 tasks. When your tasks are done, that's all I need you for. Now, this might in fact include not just working rice, but maybe fixing that wagon wheel over there. That's a part of your task today, right? And so you have a listing of things that they want you to do. Now, this is interesting because this can be good and it can be bad. The fact that you have a task system may mean that if you finish early enough, the rest of your day might be your own, which means you can, of course, get out and grow your own food, maybe have your own garden. You can maybe even hire yourself out to a farmer down the road if your master okays it. He'll take part of your wages, but you can work for Farmer Johnson down the road who needs extra help today, and he'll pay you, a couple pence or whatever, and eventually you can maybe earn a little money. So that's good. And you have a little bit of freedom. You're not always, remember, the slave owner is not there. The overseer is largely, in the house. He's making his rounds here and there. But he's telling you what to do, and then you're done for the day. You might have the ability to get, you have some freedom to move and some freedom to be yourself, right? So you have a sense of autonomy, growing your own crops, maybe raising animals on land that you have borrowed from your master. So all these things can be good, right? You have some freedom, you're feeding yourself, maybe renting yourself out. It could be, of course, a double-edged sword. It might not be a good thing. Because you have your own time, perhaps, if I'm your overseer or master, maybe I'm not going to feed you as well as I would otherwise feed you if you were constantly working. You have time, grow your own food. You have time, go hunting. In fact, a lot of these slaves went hungry. Also, if you end your work too early, maybe I'm not going to let you rent yourself out today. I'm going to have you, help build this barn over here, right? And so you got to be careful. You kind of, you can imagine being a slave in these circumstances, trying to think, okay, how fast do I finish this, right? Because I want to be able to do my own thing and maybe make a little money today, but, the overseer is in a bad mood today. If I finish too fast, he's going to be like, no, you can't go over there. You're going to have to stay here and do something else, right? Help finish these other tasks, which is possible. Point is, it's different, right? And again, you have plantations of rice in the Carolinas, as you have plantations of tobacco in the Chesapeake. However, they're going to be different systems, right? In the Chesapeake, you're going to see, working can't see to can't see with everybody chained together. In the Carolinas, sometimes they would be chained together, but they all have separate tasks. And so what's interesting about all of this together, especially the fact that they have very little contact with white people, because there's not a lot of white people in the Carolinas, and because the owner and the white folk don't want to go there because of the climate, you're going to see, and of course because they need a lot of slaves for rice, you're going to see the retention of African culture in these areas more so than you will in the North. They're going to have less contact with whites. So they're not going to really be speaking the Queen's English or the King's English. In New England, as we saw, and even amongst the Dutch, you will see people, the Dutch in the middle colonies, you're going to see slaves often speaking the language of the white folk. But in the Carolinas, you're not going to see that. You're going to see them having their own thing. And we're going to talk more about this later, but they're going to come up with new languages because you're seeing slaves come in from all parts of the world, well, all parts of Africa, I should say, and of course the Caribbean, and they're going to be thrown together speaking different tribal languages and different European languages. And so they're going to form their own culture. We're going to talk more about that later. But they're going to be less acculturated to white norms. Religion is also interesting. There's not going to be a real effort to convert these people. Unlike in other areas where we've seen slaves going to Dutch churches, for example, and in New England also, you're going to see slaves becoming, more Puritan-minded, right? You're not going to really see that down here. There's a lot of slaves down here. And in the eyes of the masters, you don't want these people coming together to worship in one place because they'll realize just how many of them there are. Not that they need any help with that, but but they believe, that is the white population, the masters believe that allowing these people to come together and worship will remind them not only of their numerical superiority, but it will give them a sense of communal empowerment in religion. They don't want these peoples to have the ideas of freedom put in their head. Remember, the Bible talks about Moses leading the slaves, the Jewish slaves, out of Egypt back in the day. So, in fact, for a long time, slaves in the Carolinas and in the deeper South, they're not really going to be embracing Christianity. They're going to have their own thing. They will be embracing a form of Christianity, as we'll see. We're going to come back to all of this because it's a major part at the growth of African culture as a means of survival, resistance, as a means of forming identity and proclaiming humanity. It's crucial to their survival and their struggle for equality in this country. So we're going to come back to this. What I want to talk about now is Georgia. Georgia was initially set up for a couple of reasons. One, it was set up to block the Spanish. The Spanish are in Florida. I think you can see that there in the map, right? In the red. Spanish are in Florida. And of course, the English are just above that. We've seen the Carolinas, and that space, that sort of orangey space in between Florida and Carolina. And again, back then it was Carolina, not the Carolinas, but you get the point. Today there too. In between those, you're going to see Georgia become established. It is set up to block the Spanish. It sits as a buffer zone between the English settlement and the Spanish. And that's why it's set up largely as a buffer zone. And it was that's what the king wants. It's also set up as a humanitarian refuge. They're going to the English are just going to dump their refugees there in a sense, or refuse, almost like garbage. What do I mean by that? They're going to empty out a lot of prisons and just send a bunch of poor people there. The people who set up Georgia actually want a fair shake for poor people and for ex-convicts. They believe that everybody deserves a shot. Now, there's all this land there. Why not give them a shot in England? Open up your prisons. And these are not necessarily, rapists and murderers. These prisoners are, you got to understand what the law was like back in the day in England. You can get put in jail for a slice of bread, stealing a loaf of bread. I mean, you maybe have heard of Jean Valjean, right? Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, right? Guy that steals a loaf of bread and gets hounded for the rest of his days by Javert, the detective, the French detective. It's a fantastic story. Read it. If not, watch the movie. But at any rate, these are people who deserve a fair shake, the leaders of Georgia believe. And to some extent, there is religious toleration going on here. What's interesting about Georgia is that it outlaws slavery early on. Now this is interesting because what you're hearing right now isn't really the Georgia that you know in history. Slavery in Georgia, when it's first set up in 1732, Georgia outlaws slavery. Why? Well, it's wrong. This is not humanitarian, right? This goes against humanity, right? Slavery is immoral. Therefore, we don't want it. But they also say, look, we're trying to set up a humanitarian refuge here for people who want to make a go of their lives. We cannot have a society built on slavery or a bunch of slaves running around because that's just going to disrupt what we're trying to do here. Remember, slaves will rise up. Wherever slavery exists, wherever humans are subjected to human bondage, they will rise up. People know this at this time, and we're going to see more of this down the road. There's already, by the time Georgia becomes established in the early years, there's already many examples of slaves rising up where slavery becomes entrenched. As a white man who wants to just work my property, I don't want to have to sleep with one eye open at night because the guy down the street has a bunch of slaves. If you hold slaves, they're all African. If they rise up, they're going to come up against me because I'm white, even though I don't own slaves. So there's a fear here of what slavery will do to Georgia. They also see it as immoral, but of course, as we know, this ban does not last. What happens? They hit on a cash crop. What's that cash crop? Rice. Rice. Georgia, of course, is good climate, just like the Carolinas, for rice. White folk don't want to do the backbreaking work that's associated with growing rice. Much like in the Carolinas, this is hard work. Swampy conditions and stoop labor, meaning you're stooped over working in the rice. And this hard work you would have to do for low pay if you're a white indentured servant, or a white worker, or if you are a white indentured servant, you don't want to do this harsh work for the possibility that you might get something down the road, because a lot of people die under these circumstances. So a lot of white folk don't want to come here as workers who are paid or as indentured servants. And in fact, a lot of whites who do come over here, and they do, as indentured servants, and by the way, some black indentured servants, a lot of these often run away. And so, much like other colonies, Georgia actually is going to change its mind on how to deal with its labor system. It becomes quite clear that Georgia, in the early years of its existence, is becoming a refuge for runaways from other colonies. A lot of indentured servants, white and black, are fleeing the other colonies, going south to Georgia. A lot of white indentured servants are going there because they want to flee their indenture and maybe pick up some land in Georgia. And a lot of the slaves and black indentured servants run to Georgia because they want to pass through it on the way to Spanish Florida. Spain at this time has outlawed slavery in Florida. Why? Well, it's not because they care so much about black folk, but because they want to use this they want to weaken the English colonies. Slaves learn that the Spanish have outlawed slavery in Spanish Florida, and they're not stupid. Slaves have their own communication networks that cross colonies. They hear, they know, and when they hear this, they try to run south, and a lot of them do make it. We're going to come back to that. The point is, Georgia has hit upon a cash crop. It needs workers. White folk don't want to do it. Georgia is also becoming a refuge for runaways, indentured servants to black indentured servants to black slaves. Also, other colonies are complaining about this. Georgia is the only colony in the English colonies that does not allow slavery. So that's where people are going to run to, especially if you are a slave owner in the Carolinas. You're going to complain. Georgia, change your ways, man. My slaves are going your way. They might still go your way to try to get to Florida, but if you legalize slavery, only slaves are black, then anybody seen walking around as a black person will automatically be suspicious. So, in 1759, Georgia turns its back on black folk. It legalizes slavery. Slaves begin to be imported in large numbers, much like the Carolinas. And of course, slave codes are implemented, much like the Carolinas. So really, the Carolinas and Georgia are very, very similar. They have the same cash crop, the tax system. They have, legal slavery, huge populations of black plantations, and of course, slaves that are going to be largely removed from white culture. And this rice cultivation, of course, will be hard work with harsh punishment. It will mean less supervision, but it will also mean the perseverance of African culture. Continued contact with other Africans is going to mean that they're going to be able to maintain their African culture a lot longer than northern slaves. This in itself will be a form of resistance. So the point is, slave life differs across the colonies. Here you see graphic with the number of slaves that have been brought in by the early 1700s. I mean, just so you get a feel, right? You can see the numbers, the differences, north and south, and you can kind of get. I mean, look at Carolinas, and Georgia, of course. You're going to see a lot, and of course, so basically, there's a difference north and south. Let's put it that way. Enslaved life will differ across the region of what will become the United States. Even Florida is going to be the United States down the road, right? And there are slaves here. There are French people who own slaves. There are Dutch people who own slaves. And they're going to be using slaves for a variety of reasons. The Spanish and the French are going to use the slaves for defense against the English settlers, against native peoples. The Spanish and the French and the Dutch are going to be doing this, but also building forts and so forth, and building bridges and carrying stuff. One thing is important to know is that not all black people are going to be slaves, though, within these areas. As I said before, there's also a growing population of free black folk among the Spanish, among the French, among the Dutch, and even among the English. The English are going to have a great variety of slaves. We know that there's going to be a stark difference north and south. In New England, they're going to be more acculturated to English ways because there are a few slaves there. A lot of them are domestic workers. They're going to be close to white families, less likely to find marriage partners, even though it's allowed in New England between slaves. There are very few slaves to marry. A lot of them are going to be speaking English, especially because many of them are going to be brought as children, are going to be taught to read by the family. They're going to be acculturated into Christianity. These slaves in New England are going to be more likely skilled workers with more freedoms. In New England, you're not going to see a lot of slave rebellions. And so you're going to see much more quote unquote freedom. And the Mid-Atlantic colonies is going to be more similar to New England than it is to the South, although it's going to be a little stricter. The South, we know, right? These are slave societies, unlike in the North, which are societies with slaves. In the South, we have the Chesapeake. Cash crop is, of course, tobacco, harsh, back-breaking labor, stoop labor. Slaves are going to be more dependent on the owners for food and shelter, and they're going to have very strict slave codes. In the Deep South, you are going to have strict slave codes, but the cash crop is going to be rice. You will have back-breaking task system labor, and that means that they're going to have a little bit more independence to build their own houses, grow their own food, preserve their African culture. They're going to be learning little English, and they're going to be least acculturated to English ways. They're going to have the tax system and absentee owners. It is interesting that despite all of this and the strict slave codes, it is going to be in the South, the Carolinas and Georgia, where you're more likely to see maroon communities crop up. These maroon are communities of slaves that go off into the woods and establish their own communities. And this is going to, of course, happen where more slaves are present, Carolinas and Georgia. So there's a lot of differences, especially North and South. But even within the North and even within the South, there's going to be differences, as you can see. And the slaves recognize these differences. They also recognize that the farther south you go, the harder slavery is. You go from New England to the middle colonies, there's a change. You go from New England to the Chesapeake, and that's a huge change. And of course, you go to southern parts of, go to Carolina and Georgia, you're going to see a massive change there. So you can imagine how this could also be used as a form of control. If I'm a slave owner in New England and you're misbehaving, I might say, you know what? You better behave, or I'm going to sell you. Worse yet, I'll sell your child to the South. If you are a slave in the Chesapeake and I'm your owner and you're getting kind of uppity with me, right? As they would see it. If you're getting uppity, I might be like, you know what? You know how bad it is down south. You know what? I'm not even going to sell you to the Carolinas. I'm going to sell you to the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean. Yeah, you're from Virginia. I'm from Virginia, right? We're up here. You're working the Chesapeake, but I'm going to sell you to the Caribbean, or worse yet, your child. You better behave because your child will not live to age 15 down there, working in the sugar plantations. If I can get somebody to buy them at all, right? So the point is, you're not going to have your child with you, and your child will be subjected to some of the worst form of slavery, the worst in human history, the farther down south you go. Sugar Islands being the worst. Carolinas and Georgia with the rice plantations being a close second. So I'm going to leave it there. And the next time we're going to talk more about slavery and how it exists in the colonies and how slaves will try to revolutionize their lives within these circumstances. Okay, people, thank you for listening. Be good and be well. Take care. Whew, I almost thought I wasn't recording. Okay, I am. I think it can still hear me too. Hey, hang on. They can still hear me. See you guys.